All right, hello everyone. Meteorologist Carly Smith here. We are ready to get started. Don't forget to post your comments and questions in the comments, and we are going to get started. So, of course, Hurricane Beryl, that is what we are looking at. Thank you so much for joining this live update. Make sure you share this with your friends and family, especially anyone in the path or potential path of this hurricane. Of course, anyone with plans to the Caribbean or even the Yucatan Peninsula, this is definitely something to keep an eye on if it is for later this week. So if you've got holiday weekend plans, 4th of July plans, anywhere to the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Cayman Islands, and then of course in the Yucatan, that's Cozumel, Cancun, all of these areas, popular vacation destinations, and under the path of this really strong Category 5 storm. Of course, Beryl has made a lot of history. So right here, we are looking at our tropical headlines where Beryl is the first to reach Category 5 wind speeds in history since we've been keeping track of our tropical systems or hurricanes historically. Beryl's the first to reach Category 5. That did that last night at 10 p.m. Emily reached Category 5 in 2005 on July 17th. And typically we don't see our first major hurricane, which by the way is only Category 3 strength or higher. That typically comes around September 1st. So that's just to emphasize how strong this storm is. Now, there's a lot of signs. In fact, I'm pretty confident that Beryl will weaken as it continues to travel west through the Caribbean. So that is where the confidence lies, is the weakening trend. The exact path that it takes into the Gulf of Mexico is still a bit uncertain at this time. So if you jumped on this live stream and were like, all right, they're finally going to tell us exactly where this is going, it's not necessarily the case. We have to err on the side of caution, though, no matter which direction it goes once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. And I'll let you know what I'm thinking and why I'm thinking it. What are the model trends? What are the meteorological signs for everything that goes into this weather forecast? But it is not easy, and I'm just going to be straight and upfront with that. So Category 5 still producing 200-mile-per-hour wind speeds. The latest forecast from the National Hurricane Center, this is the forecast cone, does include Corpus Christi, right? And technically not Corpus Christi. Technically, we're just barely out of the cone, but that's getting way too specific for this time being. The forecast cone goes out till Sunday morning at 6 a.m. And again, there's a lot of nuances with a forecast cone that make it very easy to just focus on this cone. There are impacts that happen outside of the cone. There are impacts that happen where the center of the storm is. That's not going to happen outside of the cone. So what the cone is essentially telling us is this is anywhere the center of the storm could go. So at this point, yes, the coastal bend is included in the cone, but we still could see the path of this storm go straight into Mexico, right? And if it does that, our impacts would be very minimal. But if it takes this northern turn right through here, let me move the map and redraw those arrows. So, okay, if this cone means the center of the storm could still be on the far south edge of the forecast cone, right? This is showing it's called the cone of uncertainty for a reason. It gets wider as the forecast becomes more uncertain, right? So it's really tight and narrow here through the Caribbean. In fact, it's so tight and narrow that the impacts are felt well outside of the cone. That's why you've got a hurricane. I believe that's a hurricane warning. Yes, it should be. If it's not, it might be tropical storm warning, actually. That would make sense. Okay, so it looks like I could actually query this and find out, I believe. So yeah, we've got a tropical, those colors are very close. We've got a tropical storm warning, which means they're anticipating tropical storm winds and tropical storm impacts for the Dominican Republic. But then over here in Jamaica, we do have the hurricane warning, and that's because the center of the storm could easily pass right over the island of Jamaica, and we do not want that. So Haiti and the Dominican Republic with tropical storm warnings, and the impacts will start now all the way through Wednesday for those islands. Jamaica could still be a Category 4 storm later on tonight and into Wednesday morning. So this would be Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. through Wednesday at 7 p.m. The Cayman Islands are under a hurricane watch right now. That that would be for impacts starting Thursday, so passing the Cayman Islands by Thursday at 7 a.m. Then this is when our questions really start to become a little bit more clear. So that would be Thursday evening. Thursday evening, we'll have a really good idea at maybe even earlier, maybe even by Thursday morning. But Thursday's when we start to get a clearer forecast on what could happen in the Gulf of Mexico, right? And that has a lot to do with where this hurricane ends up passing over the Yucatan. So this northern track, if the center of the storm is closer to water whatsoever, if it's closer to water, that means it could stay stronger. And additionally, it has a better chance of going north, which could be north toward Houston and Louisiana, or it could be closer to Corpus Christi, the coastal bend. But a more northern track would keep it a little stronger and allow it to really tap into the edge of that high pressure and how that high pressure sets up. So we'll get into more of those details if you're curious about that. We'll get into what the high pressure looks like and how it could steer the storm and all of that. But you do see, of course, this storm moving or has the chance to pass on the northern edge, and once it does that, we get a better grasp on where exactly it will go once it gets into the Gulf of Mexico. If it passes on the southern edge of, I didn't mean to turn the arrow around, if it passes on the southern edge of the Yucatan Peninsula, closer to Belize, then that would mean it will be weaker in the Gulf of Mexico, and it may not be able to tap into the edge of that high pressure. And it likely would continue to track on that southern path right into Mexico. But you do see, is it going to bring up cities? Let's see. Okay, so these are the cities. So all of our storms or tropical waves lately have been headed almost right toward Tampico, Mexico. And that is in the potential path of Hurricane Beryl at this point, likely a tropical storm by this point. But odds are it's going to travel in a similar way of all those other tropical waves. The one caveat is our high pressure is changing and moving, right? So as the high pressure changes and moves, and if it gets strong enough, it's going to create more steering winds around the edge of the high pressure that take it a little further north. If this storm is weak enough, it's going to hug the land more so and tap into more of those westerly winds, those typical tropical winds that take it into Mexico. So again, the cone of uncertainty gets wider in the Gulf of Mexico for a reason, because we are still a bit uncertain on this forecast. And so as you can see though, it is important for preparedness to know that it's not out of the question that Hurricane Beryl, likely a tropical storm by the time it's reaching the Gulf of Mexico, but could have an impact on the coastal bend. It's not a bad idea to start getting prepared. I mean, we're in the cone, so it's not like we're over here in New Orleans, like, oh, it's a crazy chance that it's coming for us, right? But yeah, there's a chance, and it's important to be prepared. And I think that's what you should take away from this live update. But okay, so here's the cone, right? We're still very confident that this system will weaken as it travels across the Caribbean. And so this is why, let me find the wind shear. This is why, wind shear. So as you see the cone, again, the cone is just the center of the storm, but as you see the cone passing through the Caribbean, look at all that wind shear. So once it gets to Jamaica, still like possibly a Category 4, there's wind shear on one side of the storm. Once it gets here, it is going to interact a lot more with wind shear. And that all has to do with this upper level low that's setting up over the kind of southern Gulf and northern Caribbean. And that's going to work. So what wind shear does is essentially it tilts the hurricane. So a hurricane likes it when it's not interacting with any wind shear, because that allows the eye wall to be strong, and that's what's happened to Beryl so far. It has a very strong eye wall. It's not tilted whatsoever. There's normal wind flow. There's little to no shear, and it is able to thrive. Once it runs into that wind, it tilts a little bit. And if you have heard me talk about tornadoes or severe thunderstorms or things like that, a tilt is actually necessary for a severe thunderstorm to keep fueling itself, because that tilted updraft keeps the downdraft separated. But that's not how a hurricane works. So a hurricane is totally different than that. And so once wind shear tilts that eye wall, then the hurricane's going to become weaker. It's going to disrupt the wind flow. It wants to be in this perfect like carousel circle, and if you tilt the carousel, it's going to cause some problems. And so the strong wind shear disrupts the flow, and in turn, it makes the hurricane weaker because it just doesn't have the right support. It's kind of like, you know, build any construction, right? You're not going to put up those supporting beams in a house or a building crooked. You're going to have them straight up and then support them. I mean, you do support them with angled triangle supports and all this stuff, but that supporting beam is going to be straight up and down essentially, and so that keeps it stronger than if you built everything on a lean. It's not going to be very strong. So anyway, that is why wind shear plays a role. We'll go back and look at wind shear on this entire path. So as it travels through the Caribbean, there it is. There's the wind shear that's going to start to weaken it. And so I need to extend this graphic. It keeps interacting with wind shear as it approaches the Yucatan Peninsula. Additionally, the land itself adds to wind shear as well, because the land creates friction, which means the wind's going to travel slower over the land than it is above the land or over the water. So over the water, the wind's going to be able to speed up, and then over the land, it slows down. And that makes a hurricane a little bit more lopsided and uneven as well, further weakening it. That's why you don't get hurricanes across the land, because of the friction and the wind shear that is associated with the friction associated with land. We still have a lot of wind shear. Whoa, I just went too fast. We still have a lot of wind shear that is going to be interacting with in the Gulf of Mexico. And so that would further continue to keep this storm at a tropical storm strength. So the confidence is there for at least some sort of weakening of the system as it continues to travel west. That is there. The exact path is still a bit of a question mark. So here are the latest model runs of the spaghetti plot, right? So a lot of confidence as it's headed toward the Yucatan, but just a little bit, I need to put, or I'll edit this so then we can zoom in and stuff. So right here, there's a lot of confidence that it's headed right for the Yucatan Peninsula, a lot. Whenever you see stuff look this straight, that's pretty confident. But the caveat is, like we've said in our forecast, just this little distance over the Yucatan. So I'll just use this arrow for now. Oh, okay. So a model here is going to travel over less land. A lot of the hurricane's still going to interact with water. There's Cancun, by the way. And Cozumel, I believe, is this little island. Anyway, the closer it is to Cancun, the more it's going to interact with the water and the stronger it's going to be, and the closer it's going to be to that high. The further away from Cancun it travels, it's going to stay further south, and it's going to interact with land. It's going to be cut off more from the water the further south it is into the Yucatan. So even though the distance between all of these little model runs is very minimal, it does play a big role once it travels over the Yucatan, just because of how much water it is or isn't interacting with. And so that's a key point of this forecast. Then, as we move on, you see there's a little bit more certainty in some of the models, but there's still this nice big split once it is approaching land. And I will say too, the European model, so this green one that stays south, is typically a more reliable hurricane model than some of these others that are traveling north, right? So it's a tough forecast. Yes, there are a lot more signs that this storm is moving north, and this setup right here, the one thing I'm not certain about is how strong this high pressure is, because it's really not that strong of a high. There's not a huge difference. The winds probably won't be steering it super strong around the edge of that high, but you do see too here, this is exactly what we've been talking about. All of these runs that are further south on the Yucatan go straight into Mexico. Anything that's a little bit further north that interacts more with water turns. So you see this farthest north one, right? That's the one that has a better chance of getting Louisiana or Houston, whereas anything in the middle is kind of fair game, honestly, for impacting South Texas and the coastal bend. So yeah, still uncertain. There's still uncertainty in the forecast. It's not certain enough to make a call and be like, this is exactly what's going to happen, unless we were in, well, even the Yucatan, there's some uncertainty over exactly where it hits. But I would be certain, obviously, that anywhere in the Yucatan is going to see some impact from the storm, whether it's heavy rainfall, storm surge, flooding, additionally, the wind. So, yeah, anyway, I want to stay zoomed out and look at how the high pressure moves around. Okay, so here's our high right now. So it's right here. And essentially you see it kind of just, the storm path just skirting around the southern end of this high, right? Now, one thing that I haven't thought a lot about, but probably should, is this high. This western high is going to be much stronger than this eastern high, but there's a cold front, essentially, that separates the two and weakens any pull that that western high would have on trying to bring it a little bit further west. But at this point on Thursday, everything's still heading west, which is what pulls it into the Yucatan. Then Friday, I would say it's still moving west at this point on Friday. It would be Saturday morning is the first sign of that high breaking up. And it's weak. So I think the strength of the high is going to play a role. If the high is weak, if the high is this weak, I would say it keeps going west, north, or northwest at least. So that would still be Mexico, but Brownsville, the valley could have some of the bigger impacts. Then the high still during the day as temperatures heat up is still interacting with that western high because the front isn't going to totally separate them. So we've got this trough. I keep talking about front and all this. So this is a trough, right, where you see the gray and where you see the blue. That is essentially, there's a weak cold front that approaches Texas. So as long as this cold front stays right around the Red River Valley area, some model indication does indicate it gets further south, kind of like central Texas, Waco area. That's about where the influence will be. And at that point, it still keeps these highs interacting with each other. It's not totally weakening the pressure so much where there's a clear gap between the highs until we get to Sunday. And so, I don't know, the timing is a really close call, but this is just me thinking out loud. Yeah, anyway, the main takeaway is be prepared, and there is still uncertainty. We'll have a better idea tomorrow. We'll have a great idea Thursday, and by Friday, we'll have landfall in the Yucatan, and things will be getting much simpler, but that limits our time, right? So you really don't want only 2 days to prepare for a storm, whether it's a tropical storm or a hurricane. Of course, a stronger hurricane would be worse. The good news is at this point, we are looking at it being weaker, likely a tropical storm. If it were to be a hurricane, likely a weaker hurricane, and that all has to do with that wind shear. And so that is something I'm pretty confident about seeing is the wind shear. And there's also some Saharan dust. So right now it isn't interacting a whole lot with Saharan dust. There's a little bit in the path of Beryl, but not a lot. It's kind of right out ahead of it and right behind it. But look what happens in the Gulf. We get a plume that comes up as the high pressure strengthens. That dust is going to tap into the high pressure faster than Beryl is. And so the dust is going to be sent out ahead of Beryl, and there you have it. That will keep it weaker. So another plus to keeping it at least weaker, no matter where it ends up going. The wave forecast is another thing that I keep an eye on with the swell action. So you see swell, storm surge, all can be outside of where that cone is. So the cone is essentially where the center of the storm is going to be, and the center of the storm is basically indicating where the strongest wind gusts are going to be. Outside of that cone, you can get storm surge, you can get tropical storm force winds, even some low-end hurricane winds, depending on the strength of the storm. So don't take the cone as like say all be all, right? I think that's something important to remember too. Even though I'm writing headlines like South Texas included in this forecast cone, it's not the say all end all be all. Remember with Alberto, we were never in the cone, but we saw some big impacts for some of our coastal locations like Rockport and the island with some coastal flooding and things like that. So the cone is not the say all be all, but it does indicate, I mean, with the northern turn, obviously the National Hurricane Center, they're the experts at hurricane forecasting. We take their knowledge and then put it into the localized section so we can prepare anyone in South Texas in the coastal bend, Corpus Christi, Rockport, Port Aransas, Aransas Pass, Ingleside, everyone, Kingsville, even areas inland, Alice, what our impacts may be. And so this is the GFS, this is the American wave forecast, it's the wave watch forecast technically. And so it has, the good news is, I mean, it's a good sign when you see the waves spread out like that. So this little tight swell action with 25 plus foot swells is horrible news, especially for Jamaica. I think that could wind up being some of the biggest impact is going to be that storm surge as well as the really strong winds. But then you see Cozumel, Cancun likely seeing some big impacts there. But as the storm gets weaker, the wave forecast also trends weaker. And so that's a good sign is when different layers of a forecast model are all trending similar. But this does send the larger swells, and by larger, I mean 6 to 12 foot swells toward the coastal bend or even Victoria. So the GFS has, there's the second wave, which looks a little bigger in the swell forecast than it has all week. But anyway, the GFS has been very consistent about taking the storm north over the last several runs, while the European model has been very consistent about taking it south. So we like to look for model consistency, but it's hard when both models are saying different things with the model consistency. So I feel like all I'm doing is just emphasizing that I still haven't made a call, but it is, I mean, it is still too early. Really, at this point, we don't want to cause fear. We just want to let you know what is happening and what could happen, what the worst case scenario could be, what the best case scenario could be. That's part of the job as well. Instead of just making a call and sticking with it and being wrong, it's important to be transparent and fluent when you are forecasting things that can be devastating. So the model accuracy with time, we are less than a week out now, essentially. So any impacts to the coastal bend would be Sunday through Tuesday, depending on how fast or slow this speeds up as it gets weaker or slows down. How fast or slow the speed. So some trends do have it slowing down quite a bit in the Gulf of Mexico. Right now it's booking in at about 22 miles an hour or so, but at a week out, so today is Tuesday, so we're still, with it being Sunday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday, we're still about 5 days out at this point, which starts to be a reasonable forecast, but we're not quite at that good or excellent level yet. In fact, I was hoping that tomorrow I would do more of a bigger, deeper dive for this live, and then of course the forecast cone came out and everyone's going to see that it does include a portion of the coastal bend. So there we have it. A lot of meteorologists still only really show the 3-day forecast cone because that is when it's most accurate. Obviously the uncertainty grows 3 to 5 days out, and the forecast cone only goes 5 days out. So yeah, anyway, I'm gonna take a look at some of your questions now. Toilet paper and water bottles. Anna and Steven, where and when is WWE this weekend? That is what I want to know. There is still Saharan dust in the Gulf, and it would help to keep a storm to a minimum. That's why in this forecast cone, it's at tropical storm force in the Gulf of Mexico. There is dust, which is dry air, and hurricanes don't like that. And there is also wind shear, and hurricanes don't like that. Something hurricanes do love, though, is warm water, and we have got that aplenty. So all of this in red shows how warm the water is. So something to watch with that second system, which has a low chance of developing this is the yellow on this screen. That's the tropical wave. I think it's Invest 96L. It has a low chance of developing. The Weather Service the National Hurricane Center has been lowering that chance daily, but it is about to move into the much warmer water. So even with Beryl tracking over this region, it hasn't really lowered the water temperature much. So nice warm water could allow for that to have a better chance of developing later on this week. So this one is still worth keeping an eye on. I'm not worrying about it. Of course, Beryl, a little bit of worry now at this point, but still mostly just watching and preparing for the possibility of some impacts to the coastal bend. So when it comes to rain, I think I was a little bit more conservative than Alan was yesterday, but my rainfall forecast Sunday and Monday. So the reason I did Monday is even with the Europeans forecast, we get some moisture that starts to come up a little bit later as it kind of moves into Mexico and falls apart. Some of that moisture may tap into that high pressure pool to the north, right? So the European model is a little later, whereas I believe that's right. I don't have my forecast sheet right in front of me. But anyway, one model was a little later on rain. The other one was a little bit earlier. And so, yes, there's a chance we see rain. How much is very dependent on where the storm ends up going and if the moisture is pulled apart as it goes through shear and so forth. But this was my rain forecast. And then I also have this, which shows where the spaghetti plots were, but it has it has the rain overlaid on it. So the green is the potential for rainfall. So and the white is highlighting what may happen. So the second storm is going to run into some shear, and it actually might get pulled up to this little low that develops in the Atlantic. A lot of that moisture may get pulled more so into that low than that second possible system in the Atlantic. But regardless, here's Beryl. Again, there's still some uncertainty in the forecast, but I drew this with the latest forecast cone. So the Hurricane Center has kind of bumped it up a tiny bit more north, where now my bottom line is not in line with the cone anymore, but it's not a huge pull yet to the north. There's still a decent shot that it does head to Mexico. But what you see is there's a cold front, and that cold front's going to weaken that high, and that's why I'm not like jumping in. But it is going to also create, wind does want to flow toward a cold front, but it's going to be much weaker on our end. And there's actually a little low that shows up in the Gulf as well, but that's at the upper levels. And that actually would work to hinder the hurricane, because at the top of a hurricane, in the upper levels of a hurricane, it actually is high pressure, whereas the surface is where the low pressure is. So that's another added factor. Those would be creating shear against each other because the winds would be spinning opposite directions. But this model is the European, And so when it comes to rain, the front helps bring a chance of rain about maybe as far south as San Antonio. I would say like Austin and Waco. Northern suburbs of Houston have a chance for some of that rain, more so from the cold fronts. That would be Saturday and Sunday. Then Monday, this is the European model again, which keeps Beryl further south and historically is a bit more reliable with tropical systems, but it has some rain from that shear that's pulling the moisture north around the high toward the cold front. It has some rain approaching us by Tuesday. So the European was the later one where there was a little bit of rain Monday, more rain Tuesday, Wednesday. The GFS is a little bit more aggressive with a system impacting Texas, with Beryl impacting Texas. So that would bring rain. It looks like maybe a little bit starting Saturday, but more so Sunday, Monday, Tuesday would be rain in the GFS scenario. But this scenario, the big takeaway is, look, even this little model, you don't want to take a model run for granted and say it's the say-all, be-all. But this is on the southern edge of this forecast cone, right? The southern half. We see minimal impacts here in the coastal bend with this southern edge forecast cone. If it goes more so on the northern edge, we could see much higher impact here in the coastal bend. And I think that's really the big takeaway, is where it ends up going is going to play a big role in whether we see nothing and it feels like a bust, or we see a ton and it feels like a bust the opposite way. So, yeah. An additional caveat to this forecast is with the higher waves and larger swell, there likely will be some coastal flooding, even if it passes south. So the European model had swells about 5, maybe 6 feet, which wouldn't be horrible for us in terms of coastal flooding. But with the help of some that southeast wind as well, it's something to keep an eye on. I forgot where I was going with that. Oh, the new moon. The new moon is on July 5th. So Friday is a new moon. The new moon, typical rise in tide, is typically not quite as aggressive as the full moon, but both the new moon and the full moon is when the gravitational pull is bringing higher swell or higher tides naturally to Texas and across the area when you have the full moon and the new moon. So our tide could be a little bit higher on top of it, which is kind of what we saw with Alberto. We had a full moon during Alberto, and that added an additional foot, essentially up to an additional foot of that inundation because of the high tide. So the new moon may play a similar role as well. So that's something to keep in mind. That would be Friday. The new moon happens, and then Saturday, Sunday. So this weekend, this holiday weekend, regardless of where exactly Beryl goes, we could see some coastal flooding. So the beach might not be the best for the 4th of July weekend. But yeah, so this is the day after 4th of July. Greatest impact to the Yucatan Peninsula past the July 5th. That's when it moves into the Gulf, and we could have 2 to 3 days once it moves into the Gulf before we feel or have any direct impacts here in the coastal bend. So that is pretty much the best forecast I can give right now. I hope this was helpful in some way at least. So Diego had asked, would it hit us as a hurricane? As of today, the forecast calls for a tropical storm. I don't see it being much stronger than that. I would consider a Cat 1 hurricane not out of the question, but the current forecast as of today would have any would have tropical storm impacts. Right now, Ash, if you're still watching, Ash Nicole, I would say obviously the more direct of an impact, the greater it would be. But even the lowest case scenario, I think there will be some coastal flooding. I don't think it would be worse than Alberto at the lowest level. A more direct path could have a little bit higher inundation. For the beaches, more so. That would be North Beach, Rockports, areas that are right along the water, canals, likely going to see a higher tide. Regardless of where this actually ends up going, it's likely going to be a higher tide. How high depends on how close it gets to have a direct impact on the coastal bend. And by direct impact, I mean where the center of the storm moves on land. So the stronger winds are, the more water it's going to push up. And right now the wind speed forecast isn't anything crazy. Our wind speed forecast is just in general, looking at the model data, maybe some gusts 30 miles an hour. If it gets closer, then we could have tropical storm strength wind, which would be that 50 mile per hour gust, 50 to 65, I believe. So, or that's sustained. So that would have much more impact on pushing more water toward the coast, especially if we're on the northern side of the storm. So that's going to play a role as well. Almost all of the modeling has it still fairly south of the coastal bend, and so being on the northern side, the north side of this would lead to higher storm surge. So as we get closer and we start saying, you know, it looks like it'll pass south of Corpus Christi, that would mean higher storm surge. If we start saying it looks like this is going to pass north of Corpus Christi, that would be lower storm surge. But then it's going to depend on how far north and how strong the winds are if we see any of the major wind impacts. But it won't let me scroll back up, so I don't remember all your other questions, Ash, but let's go back. Tomorrow I'll have better graphics that are prepared for different scenarios for Corpus and the coastal bend. We won't just focus on Corpus. I know people live other places, but basically right now, something here or even here would mean we could see some coastal flooding. It would be worse the closer the center passes to Corpus Christi. It would be less the further south it passes. Now remember, Alberto had it is going to have set up, there is going to be a high pressure setup. This is going to be our old graphics, so y'all probably wouldn't even notice if I didn't say anything, so I wish that I didn't. But I'm going to look at this. It's going to have old things on it. This is the last time I used this was Alberto. I just want to see what the low level winds are going to look like as this is coming up. And I haven't created this graphic yet for our new look. Okay, so that's not too crazy. So without, every situation is different, right? And that's what makes giving a forecast difficult. But since we just had Alberto, it's easy to compare it to that. So this little low right here and this wind that's showing up is associated with what of Beryl moves into the Gulf of Mexico. Again, the forecast right now, tropical storm. Then this is the high, and it's fairly weak at this point. So with Alberto, we had a really strong high that set up over the eastern United States. And even though Alberto passed near Tampico, Mexico, that set up this really long fetch of wind, essentially like this, which, yes, this setup would do the same thing, but this high is a lot weaker. So the pressure gradient, the pressure difference, especially if this is a tropical storm and a Cat 5 hurricane like it is currently, which I went through all the reasons why it will weaken earlier if you were watching, but this high pressure is much weaker, and so it's not creating quite as strong of a pressure gradient, and therefore we're not getting that strong fetch across the Caribbean, bringing that Caribbean water all the way up toward the coastal bend in between these two areas of high pressure, right? Or pressure, right? So that's a good sign where if this storm were to hit to our south, we're not going to see similar impacts like we saw to Alberto because of the positioning and strength of everything. In fact, this current kind of setup would push some, I mean, there could be a little bit of storm surge toward Louisiana based on this exact model. But yeah, so again, some sort of I would keep an eye on where exactly this goes. Obviously, if it's further north, we'll have a higher risk of storm surge just because of how strong the winds are around the system. If it's further south, a lower risk. If it's north, pretty much no risk of storm surge, but also our rain chances would be worse. So like best case scenario is actually it hitting somewhere toward the valley and just tracking up this way. Then we would get a lot of rain over a watershed, but nothing is really showing signs of that. A lot of it, if it hits Texas, it goes around this high up into the Ohio River Valley because there is this huge area of high pressure that is setting up over the western United States into next week. So at the low level, it doesn't show it as great, but at the higher levels of the atmosphere, that high is really strong. That's going to be right over the Four Corners region. And so that's going to keep anything from giving our watershed the best case scenario. So moving west, it would move west across Mexico around the bottom edge of that high to the north. And over here, it would move north around this high. So it's not going to go somewhere in the middle. If it means landfall somewhere in the middle, it's quickly going to go back to the north and east. Starting the 4th, so the soonest we would see impact would be Saturday the 6th. So I don't know how quickly your route has you returning, but the 7th and the 8th are more so when Corpus Christi could see impacts. And I don't think the path between Corpus Christi and Colorado will have much to worry about because of that high pressure, like I mentioned, that's setting up. But yeah, here's that high. So you'll see that with the spaghetti models. Why some of them are staying far west is because it's tapping into the high over the western United States, and those that are turning well north is tapping into this high. And so there's a lot of caveats. That's what I'm going to leave it with. I'm still on.
You're on.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we're going to be focusing on tomorrow. Pulling, obviously, but we're pulling Maddie off her live shot so we can
Okay. Okay, these are the latest Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean water temperature readings. So you're seeing 87 right by the coast, 85 in the center. There's this cool spot right over the Yucatan Peninsula. Not cool enough to like have any major impact on weakening this system. It's more the shear and the dust. But yeah, right now it's over 85-degree sea surface temperatures there at that buoy reading. So very warm temperature across the Gulf, and then of course right along our coastline. So that is going to be fuel for the system. This is well above normal for this time of year. Some historical readings, even especially out in the Atlantic this time of year. This is why we don't typically see storms that track the way this one did this time of year or get to this strength, because we're typically not quite this hot. But here we are feeling like August on all levels. So yeah, David said 95, but I finally got to your question, Cecilia. Yes, Marco, as of today, please keep up to date with the latest forecast models and trends, but as of today, it is looking like it would be a tropical storm when it hits. The storm surge does not, at tropical storm level, to me, as of today, it does not look like it would be as bad as Alberto. That can change, but that's as of today. Ashley, I'd have to look up what the temperatures were when Harvey was in the Gulf of Mexico. But that was August, so they were probably pretty hot. Probably looked similar to this, but I do not know that off the top of my head. Brownsville is in the cone, possibly a tropical storm, so I would definitely keep an eye on the Brownsville area. Yeah, of course. Okay, I am going to put the cone up one last time. The current conditions. Oh, there's one more thing I wanted to show. So this, of course, is the latest satellite imagery. The eye is getting a little smaller, but that could mean it's about to go through. You could see the convection is much farther out away from the eye than it was, say, yesterday. But it could be going. Yeah, it's getting much smaller, but you see, okay, I don't know how to pause this, but you see the pink starting to show up around the edge of the eye. It's probably going to go through its eye wall replacement cycle here shortly, so it might briefly weaken and then could strengthen back up. But it is about to run into the shear also, so as it makes aim for Jamaica, it's going to run into wind shear, and so between now and Jamaica, it should be in a weakening trend as it continues to make its way to the Yucatan. So that's the forecast cone. Again, Category 1 at the Yucatan Peninsula, tropical storm as it does approach the western or the eastern coast of Mexico, and then of course South Texas. So we are in the cone. That means we are in the cone of uncertainty. The forecast is still a bit uncertain in the Gulf of Mexico, but there's a lot we can prepare for now. And that's why we do our best to put some sort of forecast cone out. That's why the National Hurricane Center goes out at least 5 days, so you have time to prepare. Whereas if we waited till we were really confident, then that lowers the time of you have to prepare. So anyway. Thank you again, everyone, for watching this live update. Don't forget, we've got a YouTube page as well. Just search KIII TV or 3 News on YouTube. These live updates get published there. and you can watch them live. If you have YouTube TV, then boom, you've got TV also. Our stories are posted there, so it's a great way to keep up to date with local weather and local news. Whether or not you have cable TV is through YouTube. So we have a YouTube page, KIII TV, and we also have a weather app, which is you just search in your app store, KIII TV, or go to, I believe it's right here, kiiitv.com/app, and you can download our app to get the local news and weather. And the streams are done. You can find them on the app and on Roku, Apple TV, Fire TV. We've got apps there as well. So there's a lot of great ways to keep up to date with the latest forecast. You don't have to just rely on Facebook to do so, because there's a lot of noise on Facebook also. So thanks again for watching this live update. I'm meteorologist Carly Smith. I hope this was helpful.